Hey, horror fans, happy October and, well, happy Halloween because if all goes to plan, this episode should be going out on Halloween. And I'm sure you'll agree that it's a good one to be going out on this special day for us horror fans. So this is of course going to be the start of us doing a new franchise, and that is the Scream franchise. So this is our thoughts on Scream. Yeah, I mean I've got the set there, so I've got the first.
Matching! Yes,
Yeah,
nice.
pretty much. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, Scream from 1996, the Wes Craven movie, which of course really changed things for horror, for the slasher genre in the 90s. Sort of inspired everyone to go all meta with their slasher movies, and obviously created a new sort of iconic horror villain in Ghostface, and obviously introduced us to the other characters that we now know and love. So Sydney, Gail, Dewey, various other people, Randy. So there's a few different ones in there. And yeah, we're doing these movies now because Scream 5, which for some reason they're just calling Scream, but we'll call it Scream 5 because, as far as I'm concerned, it's a sequel, not a reboot. But
Yeah.
Scream 5 is coming out in January, so we've not got long to really knows what Scream is and the concept. But you do have this character of Ghostface who obviously stalks victims in like a cloak, in like a mask with like a ghost sort of design. And his whole trademark is that he talks to them on the phone. He rings up like potential victims, and he does the whole thing about what's your favorite scary movie, things like that. And he plays games with them and ultimately stabs them with a knife. But the main sort of character in this first one, and I guess for pretty much all of them, is Sydney Prescott, played by Nev Campbell, who at the time was pretty much an unknown. But she plays a character who was in the past year lost her mother, Maureen, who was killed, and there is like a person, Cotton Weary, who has been put in jail for it, and that seems quite clear cut because it seems him and the mother was having an affair. So as far as Sydney is concerned, then that's sort of case closed. But it turns out maybe not so cut and dry, because it seems like this spate of killings from this character of Ghostface may be the real killer. So the real killer may still be out there, and you've got certain tension with like the Gail Weathers character played by Courtney Cox, who of course is this hotshot reporter who covered the whole trial with Sydney and her mother and the whole killing. And Gail believes different to Sydney. She believes that actually Cotton Weary is innocent and that the killer is still out there. So she's sort of, when these killings start to happen and they think, hey, it could be the same killer, she takes a keen interest and is looking to really kickstart her career, so to speak. So you get obviously a bunch of characters. You get Sydney's best friend Tatum, played by Rose McGowan, if I can say it, yeah, and various other people. Obviously, Randy, who's like the film nerd, the horror nerd, played by Jamie Kennedy. You've got crazy Manic Stu, who again is sort of like a film nerd, but is a bit more over the top than Randy. He's like Tatum's boyfriend. Obviously, Dewey, the local like cop, who, yeah, he features quite heavily. He's Tatum's brother, so various characters, but it's obviously known for being very sort of meta and being like this sort of fresh sort of satire on the genre and critiquing lots of things, and really goes into details with a lot of the gags and a lot of like the references. And it's sort of this mix of like horror and comedy. You go through these movies, it is how much that sort of stays true, because I think later on they do, for good or for bad, but they do obviously push harder on the comedy stuff. Whereas I think certainly in this movie, I would say it's a nice little mix. I think it still feels that it's taking itself quite seriously as a horror movie while still being very funny and satirical. I think obviously the opening scene definitely feels like a proper sort of horror type scene. So way to again subvert your expectations. Drew Barrymore, a massive star, is of course killed off in that opening scene, and we kind of get this fresh new star in Nev Campbell, who was sort of made by these films. But before we start, I think obviously a lot of people might know our feelings on this film, but Rachel, what are your memories of seeing it really for the first time? Because we obviously sort of grew up with it, so.
I am okay. So I didn't see it when it first came out. Obviously, I was way too young. I was like 10 when it first came out. So I was a little too young to obviously see it when it first came out. I don't actually clearly remember exactly when I first saw this movie. What you have to understand is Scream is actually one of my favorite movies, just full stop. And if we ever do a top 10 horror list, I'm giving it away right now, but I don't care. It's my favorite horror movie. I love this film. And because I love it, I watch it all the time. So trying to remember when I first saw it is not even, I don't even want to try.
It's like they just blur sort of
exactly.
Yeah.
I do remember when I first saw it, though, I didn't know that Drew Barrymore was going to die. Like that, like I'm pretty sure I was a teenager. I was probably 17 or 18. I do remember it was one of the earliest horror films I saw when I first started to seriously watch horror. And I do remember watching that opening scene and being completely stunned by the fact that they killed off Drew Barrymore, because not only was she the biggest star at the time, but she was part of all the promotional material. Like I remember watching trailers, and she's in all the trailers. She's on the movie poster, and of course, you know, being the biggest star at the time, we all thought that she was going to be the final girl. And so, right from the beginning, when you have that scene, you know you're in for a very different type of movie. You know, it was such a great subversion, kind of a little homage to Janet Leigh in Psycho, killing off your star before anyone really realizes it. And what I really love about Scream, and what I think is so ironic about Scream, is that they made it to kind of kill the slasher genre, because the slasher genre had sprung up in the 80s, obviously. After Halloween in the late 70s, you had Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Hellraiser and all of the slasher films that from the 80s kind of came up. And then the early 90s, they kind of died out a little bit. Like the early 90s, if you look at horror in the early 90s, it was a bit of a mixed bag. You know, you had some cheesy stuff like Leprechaun and, you know, some of the later Nightmare films, but then you had some really cerebral stuff like Silence of the Lambs and Candyman. So it was a real hodgepodge of like, it's like they didn't quite know where horror was going to go in the 90s. So Wes Craven did Scream as kind of trying to put the final nail in the coffin of the slasher genre, and instead he accidentally revived it. And I think that is just
almost like he didn't expect it to do that well, because it was like, new concept. And
exactly. And people just loved it. They latched on so hard to this idea of, like you said, this meta idea of being able to poke fun of the horror genre while still creating a very effective horror movie. And then of course after Scream you had that whole slew of like post-Scream horror films that came out, like Urban Legend and The Faculty and Cry Wolf and I Know What You Did Last Summer. Like none of these films would have existed without Scream. Now, we can debate whether or not that's good or bad, depending on the film, but I do love that Scream ushered in this whole horror renaissance, and I think that we really need to remember how significant it was at the time. You know, over time with horror, the way it reinvents itself every, you know, generation, it constantly is having to come up with new ideas and new themes. I think we forget how significant Scream really was in reviving the slasher genre.
Another thing it does, which is reasonably new. I mean, maybe it wasn't totally new, but I think for the slasher genre also to do like a whodunit style thing is actually a bit different as well. So that's something maybe people forget about. But yeah, no, it does definitely riff off certain things. Like it obviously goes into the media stuff and almost the cynicism of the media. I think it's sort of parodying that. And I think that's maybe another sort of point where you can see it as being a bit ahead of its time, because it's almost like just sort of funny now, because in many ways I think the way the media is portrayed in the film, it's probably quite true to how they were at the time, but it's almost like, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, because probably in many ways they've gotten even more crazy since then. Some of like youth in some ways, it's sort of almost like, well, if everybody knows horror movies and if everybody knows the tropes and can sort of talk about them and make fun of them, if everyone's an expert, let's say, then maybe it does kill the appeal a little bit of a good horror movie. Because I think us as horror fans, we do think of us as being in this sort of elite, maybe sort of niche sort of group where it's sort of quite cool to be a horror fan, and maybe we don't like the idea of it being too sort of mainstream kind of thing. I have really fond memories of this. I did see it a couple of times at the cinema, and I remember we will obviously talk about the twist later on, but I remember the whole twist really sort of grabbing me, and it's like, oh my God, yeah, that was really something when I saw it. And I just remember it wearing out my VHS player when I had it, because I remember lending it to someone, like my neighbour, and then as soon as I got it back off him, I just put it in the VCR and just watched it as soon as I'd got it back. So it still holds up really strongly.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
still very iconic, very smart. You've got good characters in there, really great dialogue, and it's obviously worth talking about Kevin Williamson as the writer, because I feel like him and Wes Craven coming together are sort of like the dream team, and it's like, I think if you took one out, the film maybe wouldn't be as good.
Yes.
So I think in a way they are the perfect sort of merger. But
it's a great marriage. It is.
To start with that opening scene, because it's one of the most iconic horror opening scenes, and one of my favorite openings to a horror movie. And I think it sets out the store, I think, because it's very scary as well. So I mean, I think it maybe highlights, and this isn't just going to be like a funny satire, then there are be sort of full-on horror moments. But obviously Ghostface, he rings her up, and she's obviously got, I like the fact she's got popcorn on the stove. I mean, I think that just adds to like the atmosphere sort of thing. And she's getting ready to watch like a scary movie. Now, I only have one complaint about the opening scene, and that's that Casey totally gets it wrong on Nightmare on Elm Street, because she sort of says, well, the first one was good, but the rest all sucked. And of course, that's not true, because 3 is absolutely brilliant.
Oh, I know, Dream Warriors.
So I have to pick her apart on that comment, but I guess it fits the scene. It's being sort of cynical about horror movies and stuff.
Yeah,
but it's a really good opening scene, really good atmosphere. It's a great introduction to Ghostface, because again, it's something we can look at as things go along, but I think it's probably fair to say he's maybe not quite as scary in the later movies, that maybe he loses that. But I think when you first hear him in this scene, okay, it's sort of quite funny the way he's like testing her on like horror trivia, and it becomes a game, and it sort of fits what they're going for anyway. But also I think his voice and the way he delivers the lines and stuff and is very scary, and just the way he slips in certain lines. I mean, the line about I want to see what your insides look like. I mean, that's a really chill line.
Right?
Really gets me. And the actor just delivers it so well. And there's just nice little touches, because I really appreciate how they take their time with the scene, how it's sort of paced, and it feels very realistic, the back and forth, because obviously he rings her a few different times, and she sort of is quite nice at first because she just thinks it like it's a wrong number and she doesn't realize what's going on, and she sort of lets him down quite nicely. But as things go on and he's a bit more aggressive, and she starts getting like pissed off with him. And I do love her, the way she delivers that line when it's like, "I lied. I've got a boyfriend. He's a football player, and he kicked the shit out of you."
Yeah.
The way she delivers that line is really good. But yeah, the pacing of the scene is really good, and just how it builds. I sort of like the touch of him calling her Blondie as a way to confirm that he can actually see her. So Drew Barrymore's very good in the scene. I like. I'll let you come in a minute, but one other thing I like about it is actually how it sets up this being quite a feminist film, females being tough in the movie, and I do wonder actually if it's something Wes Craven really pushed in his films, because obviously you can say Nancy, for example, in Nightmare on Elm Street was a very progressive final girl, very tough, and I think this film sets out the store from this first scene, because Casey isn't like a pushover. Like, she does fight back, and she's actually pretty smart at times. You can sort of see her sort of thinking of ways of like tripping him up, or kind of just making sure that then he's actually there. And there is definitely a struggle between them when he finally kills her, and she really fights to the end, because you see her when the parents come home like just gasping, trying to strain, and again I think good direction in the scene, because it's shot from her point of view, and it's almost like we're watching her watching the parents in the distance, and that's sort of the tragedy of it, is that she can see them, but because of her voice being pretty much shot, she can't call out, so she's sort of helpless, and we have to watch that really. But I think it definitely sets up the tone of the film for being quite strong female characters.
What you were saying about the way it's directed and the way it builds tension, because I love the way that it just starts. It's this average house and an average night, teenage girl just getting ready to watch the movies, and she gets a phone call that's maybe a little bit weird. The guy's acting a bit dodgy, a little bit cagey, kind of asking her random questions. And I like that at the beginning we get a sense of like, okay, something's not quite right here. We don't quite know that there's a threat yet, but we know that this guy's calling her and he sounds a little bit odd, and we kind of, I think, feel kind of what Casey's feeling, We're a little bit annoyed that this guy's calling her, but then she starts to engage with him, and it's like, okay, so what's going on here? But then you get that line where she's like, "Why do you want to know my name?" And he just says, "Because I want to know who I'm looking at." And then just the change in tone, the whole scene, and just Drew Barrymore plays that so well, just that shock of like, oh crap. And then she's like, "What did you say?" And he's like, "Oh, I want to know who I'm talking to." And she's like, no, that's not what you said. And so you start to get this kind of tension of like, oh no, something is not quite right here. And of course, like you said, with the popcorn on the scene, the popcorn acts almost like a countdown, because you see it get bigger and bigger, and so that once it explodes, shit's going to hit the fan. And so I think that it does such a great job of building that tension. And you mentioned the Blondie line. I love that line because I think it's so threatening, and the way that Roger Jackson, the voice of Ghostface, delivers that line, just are you scared yet, Blondie? And she just starts running to lock all the doors, to secure herself in the house. And I just think just the buildup of tension till we get to the point where she's terrified, it feels so organic, like they build it so well that by the time we get to like the real violence in the scene, it doesn't feel out of place. It doesn't feel like it's come out of nowhere. We've watched this poor girl get terrorized, and the build up to the scene where she eventually starts to break down. And I have to say, I think the trick question that he gives her is brilliant. And I think a lot of horror fans would get tripped up by that, because Friday the 13th, you really do associate Jason with those movies. So if you're in a panic and you're in a situation where you're not thinking straight, you would probably scream out Jason and then... Exactly. I mean, I think for years before I actually saw Friday the 13th, I thought that it was just Jason because I'd only seen like some of the later films. I hadn't seen the original. So I actually think that was a really clever little reference to kind of show not only that, I thought it was not only a good trick question because I think an actual person would get tripped up on that. I think it was like almost like a little meta commentary about the Friday the 13th films and how they've become to the point where everyone associates them with Jason. We all forget about Mrs. Voorhees, who was the original killer. So I thought, I thought that was like a really clever way to kind of trip her up. Now, when we get to the end of the film, we're going to have to talk about this opening scene again because, of course, we need to talk about the reveal of the killers, which it's obviously not a spoiler, but we'll get to it eventually because I think it's very interesting to think about how this scene physically actually plays out, and it actually works out really brilliantly. This first movie, there is so much attention to detail, and I think this opening scene really emphasizes that the way that the killer works and the way that Casey is taken down. And of course, I also love the scene. I love the scene that you were talking about where she sees her parents. I agree that it's a great point of view shot. Like you said, it's like we're calling to her parents with her, and you feel that tension and that horror. It almost reminds me a little bit, and again, this is another Kevin Williamson script, of the scene in I Know What You Did Last Summer, where Sarah Michelle Gellar's character is so close to getting help before she's taken out. Like Casey is kind of that whole horror of, oh my God, she's so close. Like her parents are right there. And it's just that kind of horror of you're so close to getting help, but you're still going to die anyway. And then you have that horrible scene of her mother hearing her on the phone. And I think that Scream actually does this. The Scream franchise at certain points does this really well of showing that, yeah, this is a slasher film, but these are also real people, like within the universe of the film. These are real people with families who are going to be devastated and are going to be affected by their deaths. So the fact that Casey's mother hears her dying on the phone, I think that the direction of the scene and the writing of the scene is so good that you can actually switch from that horror of from what's going on with Casey to the horror of a parent hearing their child die. And the score is beautiful in that opening scene, the way it switches from being menacing to being kind of tragic. And then, of course, you have that shot where she comes out of the house and sees Casey hanging from the tree with, as Tatum puts it, her insides on the outside, which is just, I mean, way to go out with a bang with that scene. Who want to make horror films should study this scene in a way of how to build tension, how to have build up and payoff. Drew Barrymore is fantastic. And I heard that apparently Wes Craven, to keep her crying, would tell her stories about like animal cruelty because she's a big animal lover. So that's how he kept her emotions up, which sounds horrible, but I guess it does the job.
Did the job.
But I agree with you that, sorry, you're going to say?
Well, I heard something this week about actually, which I don't know if you'd heard, but I'd heard that technically it was sort of Drew Barrymore's idea that she was going to be killed off in that opening scene because apparently she couldn't commit to doing like a whole film.
Yeah, they wanted her for Sydney. I remember that. They actually did want her for Sydney, and then she offered to be Casey because she had scheduling conflicts. So that would have been interesting if she had been Sydney. But I like Neve Campbell. Like Sydney Prescott is, and we're going to get more into this as we talk about the film, but she's a great final girl. I think Drew would have been okay in the role, but it works much better for her to be killed off in that opening scene because you immediately are told this is a different type of movie that you've walked into. And it just subverts everyone's expectations. Because I remember, like I said, I might not remember exactly when I first watched it, but I do remember being really shocked. I was like, did they just kill off Drew Barrymore? Really? Yeah. They just did that? It was a big surprise. So
I think it works more for the sort of film that it is than they sort of subverted your expectations in that way. Like we said, it's a really cool touch that she's in the promotion and stuff, and it would be interesting to know whether some of that promotion was done at the point where they were hoping she would be the lead, or
to Sydney Prescott, who is our actual final girl. Now, Neve Campbell, like you said, was relatively unknown. She was doing Party of Five at this point. I think Party of Five had been running for about a year or so, but it wasn't a huge show, Party of Five. And it was actually, I think, on the verge of being cancelled. So Scream really was what propelled her into superstardom, which you can really see because Sydney Prescott is a great character. And that's one thing I wanted to touch on with this one as well, is I think something that Scream did differently to particularly other late slashers of the 80s and a lot of the sequels that were coming out, is it had really good characters. Like, you have a lot of slasher films that don't have great characters. I think a lot of horror fans talk about this, especially like in the 80s, you would have just slews of teenagers that everyone hated. You just didn't care about these characters. They didn't really have a lot to them, mostly just horny teenagers at Camp Crystal Lake, just waiting for Jason to come along and off them. But the characters in Scream are so real and so organic and authentic. Sydney Prescott has a whole rich backstory. You can see her motivations. You can see why her character is the way she is. As you mentioned, her mother was murdered a year before, and not just murdered, but it sounds like she was murdered in a really brutal fashion. And there are hints that Sydney maybe came across the body. They don't actually say for sure, but they do talk a lot about, she was the one that testified against Cotton, so she obviously saw someone leaving their house. So she's obviously very traumatized from that. Because of that, that's affected her relationship with her boyfriend, Billy, played by crazy-eyed Skeet Ulrich. Billy Loomis, lovely little shout out there, great character. And you see that Sydney is struggling, which is fair enough. She's obviously got PTSD. She obviously has depression. She's got relationship issues because her boyfriend is a typical teenage boy who just wants sex because that's what's important in a relationship. But I must remember he's only 17.
With you saying Billy Loomis is a great character, I'll pick you up on that. I think if there's one nitpick in the film, it maybe is him, because I think he's the actor. I mean, maybe in other roles he's more effective, but I think he's very wooden in this. I think
we're going to have a conversation about this.
I think he's very sort of like grungy and moody, and I just don't see the appeal of him from her point of view. And he is kind of dickish, sort of trying to force sex onto her, which, again, I think when we see the way things go later.
Yes.
And I'm not saying, I think maybe part of the reason they cast this sort of actor and the way he is in the film is because of the reveal later on. So I can justify it on that point of view. It's just then whenever he's on Scream, it's Freudian slip, but on screen, I think he does actually drag the drama down. And I can imagine poor Neve Campbell having to play off him. Because I just think he mumbles a lot, and there's like not a lot of charisma, and he's just playing. He is very wooden for me. I think he's playing like a stereotypical sort of moody, sort of like grungy slacker type character, and I think he obviously says like really ridiculous things. I mean, like the bit where he's trying to justify, come on Sydney, get on with your life, your mother died, and he uses that really crappy analogy of well, my parents moved away, they separated, so that's the same thing. But okay, I've said my bit. You can make your defense of.
Well, I think I have to make my defense when we get to the end, because the reason that I like Billy is because of how the movie plays out. I think if the movie hadn't played out the way it did, I would be agreeing with you, because he's a douche. Like, every time he brings up the sex stuff, I'm like, dude, you have a hand, just go home. Like, you just want to kick him. And especially, like you said, in that scene where he brings up his parents getting divorced compared to her mother getting brutally murdered. It's like, dude, this isn't really lining up. But because of where the movie goes, and when you look back at all of these scenes and they have that much added stuff to it, once you know the ending, that's why I love Billy Loomis, because of that. Because I think that in retrospect, like when you first watch the movie, like I'm pretty sure when I first watched the movie, I was like, Sydney, honey, come on, you are so much better than this dude. kind of wash his hair. Like, let's just, come on, let's regroup.
It doesn't change the fact that in those scenes themselves, he is like just a boring character. I don't think he has any charisma, and I sort of do struggle to see really what Sydney sees in him. But so
yes, I think we also have to keep in mind that like their dynamic has probably changed in the last year since her mother's murder. So maybe he was different when they first started dating. Maybe she was different. Maybe there's more there that we're not seeing now because we're seeing the relationship in the middle, not the beginning. Like people are different when they first start dating. So maybe he was a little bit more charming or less skeezy or whatever when they first started dating. And that's what she fell for.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, maybe he actually, compared to the boyfriend in the second film, he actually suddenly seems much better. I mean, not as a person, but just as a character, and not quite as dull as the...
Yeah, you want to talk about Wooden? Well, when we get to Scream 2, we'll talk about Derek. Yeah.
But, yeah, I think if I have probably a nitpick with the film, it is that, but...
To Skeet Ulrich, maybe I'm just being a little biased because I like the actor. But around this time, he really was kind of playing dickheads. I mean, when you look at his character in The Craft as well, it's like I think you're being typecast here, Skeet. Like, yeah.
And I saw him in this like indie movie called Touch, which I saw.
Okay.
It's like, I think Bridget Fonda's in it or something.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's like late 90s. I think Christopher Walken was in it, but I remember quite liking it. But it's been years since I've seen it, part of my nostalgia. But I did have a crush on Neve Campbell at the time because of these movies. I think obviously really attractive girl, but also I think the Sydney character was really appealing. And just to really say what appeals about her, I think she is the classic girl next door, and she really feels like that natural, very grounded girl next door. And I think she has something of like the Jodie Foster in her, that sort of quality, like just in the way she looks and acts. I think everything's so natural, and it's like she's got striking looks, but in a natural sort of way where you don't think of her as being like glamorous. You just think of her being like an everyday sort of girl. And yeah, they really cast this so well with her. They got the perfect final girl. She's very sort of convincing in like the scenes where she's almost fighting back against Ghostface, because that's obviously something they do really from the very first scene, where obviously he attacks her, quite early in the movie. It's, from that early scene, she's very proactive and is fighting back. And Ghostface is essentially a guy in a hood, a guy in a cloak. It's not, like Freddy, a more supernatural type threat. I think they were going for a little bit more realism, where I think realistically you could, if you were tough enough or smart enough, you could get some shots on and you could. It's a different sort of threat to, you might have with Freddy or even Michael Myers. But obviously so much of what he does is through like the telephone calls and the element of surprise, almost like the way he's playing games with like his victims. So, but yeah, I think Neve Campbell's she's
good. Fantastic. She has that vulnerability, that kind of like Laurie Strode type vulnerability, and then you get to see her evolve over the movie. And of course at the beginning, like we were saying, she's very traumatized, and then when she comes to school and all of the cameras around, she talks about how it's like deja vu. It's obviously bringing up a lot of stuff. Now, I did recently come across a theory that I found really interesting, but also kind of really harsh. Someone was discussing why Casey and Steve were killed. Now, when we get to the reveal of who the killers were, there is obviously an explanation. But one of the theories that they offered up was, obviously this whole thing is geared towards Sydney, which we will learn about over the course of the film. She is the ultimate target, and she is the ultimate end goal she'll be the final kill for the killer. And someone theorized that Casey was killed partially just to unnerve her, because they talk about how she sits next to her in English class. So Sydney has to come in and see the empty seat next to her. And someone was like, and this person was theorizing that maybe she was killed as part of the plan to unnerve Sydney. And I just thought that is so cold, to actually just kill a human being, to take the whole life just to get under someone else's skin. And I think that really shows how sadistic Ghostface can be, because Ghostface he's such a great villain. He's such an interesting villain. The phone calls are so threatening. And I love that they play on that whole kind of the stranger is calling from inside the house. Phone calls in horror are obviously not an original thing. We've seen it in When a Stranger Calls. We've seen it in Black Christmas, even Halloween to a certain extent. Like, phone calls in movies are so good. So I really like the phone calls. But then Ghostface himself, when you physically see him, he's a bit of a klutz. Like, he's always flailing about and falling over shit and stuff. Like you said, like, if you were fairly athletic, you could probably take him on. But then, the fact that he can do stuff like this, like if he really did kill, like, Casey just to get to Sydney, that's really cold, man. Like, that is a stone cold reason to murder someone, and to murder someone so horribly. Now, obviously, there's probably more to it. And like I said, when we get to the reveal of the killers, we'll be able to discuss that there may have been a bit more to it. But I thought that theory was so interesting, that they were already just trying to get under Sydney's skin to the point that they would actually take a life to do so. I thought that was just kind of a cool theory. But we see Sydney.
It's an interesting idea, which obviously you could easily read into it. So it's definitely possible twist on like the gimmick of, like, the phone calls coming with it, because obviously the fact that they actually, because the way those films tend to work is then the person ringing from within the house, you wouldn't really have much of a personality. I think obviously that's sort of the gimmick and the way to create tension, and they would then, it would partly be a whodunit again, but in some ways with that they don't go as far with the whodunit as they do in this movie. So
and I really like the way that unfolds, the mystery of, like you said, like who done it. And we see as the movie unfolds, we start to get little bits and pieces as to what exactly has happened in the past. So we see that there is obviously some tension between Sydney and Gail. Again, it's all kind of done in looks. She sees Gail outside the school. When she's flipping through channels at home, she flips through a bunch of reporters, but then she stops on Gail Weathers talking about her mother's murder. We get a little bit more background there. And then, of course, we get the scene where Sydney is attacked in her own house, where she gets the first phone call. And again, it's a bit like Casey. It starts out kind of playful. She thinks that it's Randy on the other end of the line. She's kind of, giving sassy answers. I love her speech about how she doesn't like horror movies. It's always some big-breasted girl who's running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting, stuff like that. And then, of course, you get that sinister kind of drop where it's like, well, this isn't Randy. I'm standing on your front porch. And I love that Sydney, like you said, she's such a great final girl, because she just completely calls the guy's bluff. She's like, oh, yeah? Well, I call your bluff. And she walks out into the front porch and she's like, are you out here? I can't see you. Can you see me? What am I doing? And she really challenges the person. And then, of course, she goes back inside and Ghostface lunges out of the cupboard, which I want to point out. There's actually, again, this movie is so well planned and so well directed. There's a scene earlier in the movie where Sydney comes down the stairs and she opens that cupboard that Ghostface is hiding in, and nothing happens, but there is a scare cord when she opens that cupboard, like almost like it's saying something should happen, but then nothing happens. So you just kind of ignore it. And then later on, she walks past the cupboard and she kind of pauses and looks at the cupboard like she hears something coming from it. But again, nothing comes from it. And so then you have that payoff at the end when Ghostface comes out of the cupboard. And again, when you rewatch it, you see the little hints that he's already there waiting for her. So again, this film just so well planned, so well directed. Yeah. And then, of course, you have that scene where she's attacked and Billy turns up in her window like a creeper, because that's what he does. And we get our first red herring where she thinks that it's him, which, you know what, I don't blame her, because he's got the crazy eyes and he's snooping around with a mobile phone, which a lot of people didn't have in 1996. Oh, yeah, the technology in this film. I love how they have to contact the phone company to get the phone records from the mobile phone because they can't just get it off the phone. Things like that.
It's also, it's pretty funny, her as well. This is something someone else has commented on, but her actually calling the police on her computer. I mean, this is back in '96 as well.
I know, it's pretty impressive, isn't it?
I'm assuming it must have been an option, otherwise they wouldn't have known to have put it in the film. But you're sort of assuming it was very rare, then, because yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't know how to do that now. So
I know, right?
in '96, I mean, that's insane.
If you look at the program she's using, it says something about deaf to audio or something. So I think it's a program that must be invented for people who were deaf or who couldn't speak. So yeah, I mean, because the internet did exist back then in a very, early form. So, but yeah, no, that is an interesting point that she can use the computer to call 911.
Yeah, point, like Tatum over the phone mentions Tom Cruise, all the right moves, and apparently, I'm sure a lot of people looked it up to see if you could actually see.
You could see his penis, yeah.
It's tackle really, because apparently, according to Tatum, you can if you freeze it at the right place. But yeah, I mean, they really go deep with a lot of the references. I mean, at one point, Town of the Dreaded Sundown gets mentioned by Drury, and that's quite an obscure sort of cult horror movie. So they really go. I mean, they definitely go with some obvious ones as well, but I think what I like about the references in the movie is then it's almost like there's so many and so varied, then there's something for everyone. So I think if one person probably, because like I didn't get them all, but there's obviously plenty I would have got, and then there's someone who would probably get ones than I did. And I mean, I wasn't quite sure what the Richard Gere dribble story was all about. But
I don't know that one either.
To a film, yeah, but yeah. So there's so many and they're so varied. But just talking about the whole red herring thing, because at one stage, I think maybe when I first saw it, and I think they're definitely doing this on purpose, but I'll be interested to see if you thought the same. But did it ever cross your mind that Dewey could be the killer? Because I think at times they're definitely pointing you down that path.
100%. I think one of the biggest giveaway, like the biggest red herrings of Dewey, it comes after that when Sydney is staying over at Tatum's house and she gets a phone call from Ghostface. Now, obviously, this is to throw us off to try and figure out, like, because at this point we're supposed to believe it's Billy. So then she gets the phone call, and notice that the whole time she's on the phone, the mother is trying to get Dewey out of the bedroom, and he doesn't appear until after the call has finished. So that I remember when I was watching, like, the first time, I do remember thinking, hang on, is this David Arquette? Is David Arquette the killer? Oh my God. And especially because Dewey is so bumbling and so inept that you just, like, it seemed like almost too obvious that they were trying to deflect stuff from him. So yes, Dewey possibly being the killer definitely crossed my mind.
Yeah, there's certain shots that suggest him in a more sinister, because he picks up the phone in like a sinister way and says hello in like a deep sort of voice. Yeah, just the way that shot. And then I think just a bit later on at the party at the end, they're sort of hinting a little bit, because he's obviously going for a walk with Gail Weathers, and I think there's still playing on it a little bit at that
Definitely, point, I think Dewey's one of the better red herrings, because I think that it's one of those things that you kind of go, is it? Maybe, but they don't make it so obvious that it's obviously supposed to be a red herring. I think there's just enough hinted that if it had turned out to be Dewey, it could have been like, oh, okay. But yeah, no, definitely, I think there were definite hints there. You mentioned Gail Weathers. We need to talk about Gail Weathers because, brilliant character.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Friends fans, but this is the defining Courtney Cox role. It just is. I'm sure she's good in Friends, but again, just going back to the meta nature and how they're subverting things, part of the appeal is that she's playing exactly the opposite character to the one she plays on Friends. You know, she's very savvy, she's very sort of like cynical and smart, very sort of sexy, and like, it's just like a go-getter, but she's absolutely brilliant. Like, she's charismatic, she's funny, the way she delivers lines. obviously, like one of the classic lines from Gary is the film is the bit when she's had the conversation with Sid about the whole cotton weary, did he do it, did he not, and that's a good scene, partly in just creating doubt in your mind as well. That's an important scene where Sydney starts to have doubts in herself, but it's after she turns back to the cameraman, who's quite a good sort of comedy like cameraman as well, Kenny. But she mentions, if I'm right, I could save an innocent man's life, and she leaves the pause in that. Do you know what that could do for my career? Because it's almost like he's thinking, oh, she's grown a conscience sort of thing, but no. Just doing it for the
I know. She's brilliant. I think that the setup of her character is so good. She definitely embodies those like 90s reporters who were on like small cable networks and were trying to get their big break. Like you said, she's very smart. She's very shrewd. She's the only person who is questioning Sydney's, her fingering Cotton Weary as the killer. And I love that they show that while Gail is smart and is shrewd and is on top of things, she's also a complete vulture, and she makes her living off people's tragedy. And I like that they show the effect that she's had on Sydney when Sydney punches her in the face. As much as I love Gail, I'm like, no, honey, you deserved that one. Like that, you brought that one on yourself, totally. And I like the back and forth between her and Sydney, and the two different juxtapositions of the two characters, and the way that they have obviously intersected, and how Sydney obviously has a lot of resentment towards Gail for doubting her and for covering her mother's murder, and then for making a book. She's writing a book based off her mother's murder, which obviously, when you're a victim or you're a relative of a victim, that would feel very exploitative. And so you can definitely understand Sydney's anger towards Gail, but by the same token, you just can't help but love her because she's so tenacious. The way she just goes after everything she wants. She knows how to work the police. I love when they're at the station and all the reporters are hanging back and they're not letting anyone in. She's like, I'm not just anyone. And she just storms through. She'll follow the story wherever it goes. And I just think, and we'll see more of this as her character goes on in the series, but she's such an integral and vital character to this series. And everything about her characterization is just so on point. And surprisingly, she does have some layers. Again, what we were talking about, how this film builds its character so well. You think at first that she's just, and maybe at first she is just flirting with Dewey just to get information, but then you see that she actually likes it. She has some, and I actually wonder if maybe that was Courtney Cox and David Arquette's real romance, maybe coming through on the set, that it made those scenes more authentic and feel more organic. And I just love that, she confides in him that everyone thinks that she's a joke, and that, she knows that she's the Antichrist. And it's just really great the way we get to see the layers to her character. Big three. You need Sydney, Dewey, and Gail because they have been here with us from the beginning, and they're such integral characters. I think they're just so great.
I think that's fair. I think, because if you look at these movies, this first one, and obviously now that we've had a few, you do need to change it up anyway. But someone like Randy, he's an entertaining character and he's quite likable at times. But I think you can say how he is expendable over time. You do need kills to raise stakes. But I think definitely what you're saying about the core three. Because also I think with Stu in this film, I think he is an iconic character, but I think he's mostly an iconic character because of the end of the film rather than stuff that has led up to it. Because for that is just, maybe a typical sort of, nerdy, bratty teen. But it's the way they go with him and the way Matthew Lillard really hams it up at the end, which I think makes him stand out. Chemistry's there with Arquette and with Cox. And obviously, again, another really good line is Dewey saying, I'm 25. I was 24 for a whole year. And you sort of should be cheesy, but it just works in the scene, the way he delivers it, because she mentions she's been most popular with like males. I think it's
18 to 24.
Yeah, 18
yeah, something
to
like that. Mm.
So that's actually a really good like payoff line. And I like Tatum as well. I think she's
Tatum.
really
Love Tatum.
feisty and punky and a good friend to Sid, I think, as well.
Yes.
But again, it adds something a bit different to the mix because she is very different to Sid, which I think complements her. But
yes,
I also like the dynamic of her and Dewey. I love her like bossing him about really good, and the way she's just looking out for Sid, I sort of really like. But I do enjoy this thing of it's like the older brother in this film who's like the sort of wimp and the coward, and like she's just like the dominant one. And I really enjoy the stuff with her like embarrassing him in front of like the other cops. So
yeah, which is all like, I'm sorry, Deputy Dewey, but we're ready to go. And he's like, he's my superior. It's like, the janitor's your superior. Yeah, she's kind of a really sassy younger sibling, isn't she? And I think you're right that she complements Sydney because Sydney is more of a calmer, kind of more introverted character. So Tatum being sassy and outgoing and kind of a bit more upfront and in your face definitely works. And she's so protective of Sydney. Like you mentioned, she is such a great friend. She tries to shield her from Gail Weathers. She shields her from the reporters. She even tries to shield her from like when Billy and her are having fights, and she's fantastic. I love when she's talking about like after Sydney's punched Gail and she's all like, bam, Sid, super bitch went down. And I'm like, she's good, just so she's awesome. Oh, at one point she has a great line to Sydney that I totally agree with. Sydney's talking about how Billy is like putting up with her being sexually anorexic, which by the way, who came up with that line? And
I think I know the line.
and then Tatum's just like, ugh, Billy and his penis don't deserve you. And I'm like, yeah, girl, listen to Tatum. She knows what's up. Like, she's just awesome.
And I think that's the character in a T in the way that line, because she says what she feels like. She's totally upfront, but it's just this great, smart, sassy line just to sum up the situation. And it's like, we're all with her. Yeah. Billy and his penis doesn't deserve you. So it's a great line. It just nails it.
Is like just so great at being there for Sydney and supporting her and protecting her. And Sydney really needs that, because we see quite a few scenes of like how things are getting to her. And then there's that scene where she's in the bathroom and she hears the two girls talking about her, theorizing that she's a liar, that she made shit up, that she's actually the killer, and she's obviously devastated by that. So the fact that there are so many people around Sydney who are being cruel and are thinking the worst of her, it's just really great to see that she's still got Tatum in her corner to kind of fight for her against these other types that are maybe just viewing her as like an attention seeker or stuff like that. Like, it's going to be really hard to be Sydney Prescott, I think, even in this first film. Of course, makes Tatum's fate like that much sadder and that much worse when we finally get to the climax of the film.
Stakes, that's an important sort of moment and kill in the film. I do actually just want to mention, of course, the legend that is Henry Winkler as the
Fonz.
Again, the fact they got the Fonz as the principal, and it's like, again, he's almost playing with his image, like when he just has a little comb of the hair in the mirror, and but he is obviously a more smartly dressed version of like the Fonz. So I think that's great casting, and in a way it sort of revived his career, I think, because he now appears in much more than I think he did for a while, like after Happy Days, because mostly sitcoms. Obviously Arrested Development, people will know him from that, where he's really funny in that. But it's a great bit of casting, a great performance, and I sort of like how aggressive he is with those pranksters when he's with the scissors as well.
He's all like, I gotta cut you two, hang you up from the goalpost, and it's like, whoa, Fonz, calm down. Like,
the sound,
let's all just chill out.
It's like really cool. Janitor being called Freddy, and he's that's one they could have toned down a bit, maybe. But
the janitor is Wes Craven, right?
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah.
So that does
janitor's
make it kind of
little
cool,
cameo by Wes. Yeah.
But no, I enjoyed the Fonz in the film. That they definitely added.
Just a couple of things about the Fonzes. appearance. So first of all, he did that uncredited. He did that cameo uncredited, and he actually insisted that he not be involved in any of the promotion because he didn't want people to he didn't want to overshadow the new stars, because all of the stars that were in the series were kind of only just starting their career. Like Skeet Ulrich, Matthew Lillard, Rose McGowan, they've all become big since, but this was kind of like their stepping off point. They all hadn't really done much before this. I think Matthew Lillard had done like Hackers, and Skeet Ulrich had done The Craft, but no one had ever done anything really big. So he, first of all, Harry Winkler, he asked for that to be uncredited. Secondly, his death was put in there because apparently while they were filming it, for two reasons. They realized that there hadn't been a death on screen for like 20, 30 minutes. And they were like, oh shit, it's a slasher film. We need a death. And so they decided to kill the principal, but that also gave them an excuse to get rid of all the party goers later in the scene at Stu's place. Yeah, so it actually worked out quite well, his death, and I think his death is a great death scene. It's got one of my favorite shots off the movie where you see Ghostface reflected in his eye. Yeah, that is like an iconic shot and so good. And I love his hamminess when he's telling off the kids and he's like, yeah, I ought to kill you. And it's like, whoa, okay, Principal Himbry, let's all. Plus, I also love some of his announcements. At one point, he comes over the screen, he's like, remember that your principal loves you. And it's just like... Yeah,
and it's so funny, isn't it? Like when he says, school's like finished for, it's like, school's being closed for and they're cheering 1 minute, and then when he says there's a curfew, they're then booing sort of thing because they're not allowed out. So that's quite funny. But that's a good point. I didn't think of that, but that does make sense. Then it's partly, again, this film is maybe a passing of the torch, so then maybe he would insist on that. And it's a good kill. So even if it was random, I wouldn't have mind, because it is a good moment in the scene. And you do need maybe 2 or 3 kills to sort of raise the stakes. But again, it's like the cynicism of the youth that they're going for. And this is probably where you have to suspend disbelief a little, because obviously later on in the film, when they find out about his death, they actually start cheering. It's like, oh, let's go and cut him down. I think in reality, they would be like really upset. Even if it was a principal they didn't like, they would still be shocked at the fact that he'd been like brutally killed. But I think that's just the cynicism of youth that they're going for. But definitely.
So we're gearing up towards the end, but before we get to the final showdown and we can talk about all the reveals and everything, I do want to talk about just one little scene that almost seems like a throwaway scene, but I think is actually really like significant and really fun in the scheme of everything. And that's the little scene at the video store where Randy has a little confrontation with Stu and Billy when he's talking about, who's the suspect. And I think that this scene really shows why Jamie Kennedy was so good and why Randy became such a popular character, because this is where we get into the discussion of who did it, who's the eventual murderer. And you have just Randy just yelling in the video store, Stu's all like, well, why haven't they, arrested anyone? He's all like, it's because there's a formula, a very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect. And everyone's just like, and I love Stu's just like, no, he's just, no, it's good. We're all cool here. And then he points out that Billy is standing in the horror section, and we get that great little...
That's not a good look.
That's not a good look. And Stu's, like, well, he didn't do it. And he's like, well, what would be his motivation? And Randy's just like, there's always some bullshit reason to kill your girlfriend. And it's just... There are so many great lines in that scene. And again, we're getting into that whole meta horror kind of area. And I just think it's just obviously, again, when we get to the end of the scene, there's a great payoff to the scene. And it's just one of those things that it seems insignificant, but it's just not. Yeah. And this script is so detailed, and every little thing in the script is just so good. Yeah, you're going to say?
I think, no, I agree. And I think that's probably where the film gets underrated, and it is so well planned out, so well paced. I think the pacing of this film is pretty much perfect. They couldn't have done it much better. But 100%. It's sort of one of those scenes where even if it was just a scene in the video store and they're just having this conversation, and it's really entertaining. I think that's sort of the scene where the Randy character like comes into his own. But even if it was just that scene and there wasn't a lot of context, I would almost forgive it for like how entertaining it is. But it's definitely setting up some stuff for the end, I think. So it is one of those clever whodunits where when you see the twist at the end, you can then go back and sort of point to certain scenes in the film that are setting it up.
Yes.
And those are sort of like the best sort of like whodunits, the best twists, where you can look back and you can see, oh, okay, they were actually setting the groundwork. But yeah, there's a lot of fun with Randy like thinking then he's the killer, and I like him saying, "What's Leatherface doing here?" Like at the party. That's really fun. And the banter between him and Stu, I love Stu like just getting on him because he thinks like Sydney is like, you know, saving herself for him, or like because he likes Sydney sort of thing. But that's what's pretty cool about the ending partly as well, is then Randy is sort of like quite heroic and does sort of do the right thing. He's not just the typical douche who's like gonna use it to like hit on Sydney. He actually does do like the heroic sort of thing. But
and of course in that scene we also get a little bit of hint, a little bit of theory surrounding, we haven't really talked about it, but Sydney's dad is there are some hints that Sydney's dad might be the culprit and that he is possibly the murderer of Maureen as well. We see him right at the beginning of the film. He's going out of town and then we don't see him again. And they talk about how they can't get a hold of him. He's not staying at the hotel. They end up finding that the phone calls that had been made were traced to his mobile phone. So in that scene as well in the video store, Stu talks about how he thinks that it's Sydney's dad. So again, we're getting a really great suspect pool for this whole kind of whodunit, and it's kind of keeping you on your toes. So you start to get like those kind of seeds of doubt of, is Sydney covering for her dad? Like, did her dad murder her mum? Is this maybe something that she's in denial about? And I just think it's really interesting the way they plant all these little seeds so that when you finally get to the reveal, like if it had been this way, it would have fallen into place. Like you said, a good whodunit has those kind of breadcrumbs that when you get to the final reveal, it's like really good. So I like that scene brings up the dad as well. And we're all culminating to getting to that final showdown at the party, which, all right, let's get into the meat of the film, which is the party scene right at the end for curfew.
Yeah, the party scene's really good. Yeah.
It's fantastic. So of course the setup is it's curfew, so Stu's invited a bunch of people over to kind of watch scary movies and, you know, kind of celebrate the fact that they don't have school. As we talked about, Gal Weather turns up there because of course she does, because she's like a dog with a bone. She will go wherever the story
I sort of like actually how also in that scene where she shows up, she's actually like a hero to like some of the other girls. And I wonder if that's something we've lost over the years, where like journalists were sort of held up as like really inspirational like role models, because it's this idea, I mean, they might just think she's quite cool and quite hot, but I mean, it's this idea that maybe they look up to her and maybe they would like to be like journalists as well because of her. And I wonder if that's something we've lost over the years with like journalists becoming so murky and what have you. But I think that's quite a nice touch, the fact that she's almost like a rock star at that
point. Like a little celebrity who's coming to the party. And of course she plants a camera there. The camera will become quite significant. But I love Tatum like calling out Dewey, being all like, Dewey, what is she doing here? And Dewey's just like, she's with me. And he's like,
he's very excited.
And so of course we have the party, and then everyone's kind of there, and you know, nothing's really happening, and then Tatum gets sent to get some beers. And let's talk about this scene, because this scene is such a great scene, this kill scene. So of course, guys, we're now getting into big spoilery. I mean, it's Scream, you've probably all seen it, but just in case, big spoilers from here on out. Tatum's scene, when she goes to the garage and Ghostface turns up. Again, we have that whole theme of like girls in this movie are not going down without fights. Like when she first sees Ghostface, she thinks that it's Randy. She has a great line where she's all like, "Oh, what is this movie? I spit on your garage." Like just another little reference. And then when she's all like, "Oh, don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel." And then of course shit starts to get serious. And Tatum.
And we get a Casper reference as well.
Yes. Casper, that's a rap.
Yeah.
Tatum's great. But Tatum is not going down without a fight. The girl starts throwing beer bottles at Ghostface. She hits him with the fridge door. She's like really feisty. And then of course we have the cat door, which is just such an iconic, awesome kill with Tatum trying to go through the cat door, the garage door going up, and her getting her neck snapped. Ironically, Rose McGowan could actually fit through that trapdoor. They had to actually nail her shirt to the door so that she wouldn't keep slipping through because she's so tiny. But Tatum's scene, look, Tatum is... Now, I understand that characters have to die in slasher films, but like if I could save one character from this franchise, it would be Tatum, because she's such a great character. Like we said, she's such a great friend to Sydney. She's sassy. She's, opinionated. She knows exactly who she is, and her death scene is not only like one of the most creative death scenes, but it is for me one of the saddest, especially when later on Sydney finds her body. But what about you? What do you think of the scene? Is it up there for you?
It's brilliant. Yeah, I agree with everything you say. Again, I love the humor in it, the references. It obviously, a bit like the scene earlier with Sydney on the phone with Ghostface for it makes total sense that she would think it's Randy just pulling a prank, because that's the sort of thing he would do. And it's sort of one of the clever things is then it has her being cynical and making pop culture references, but it doesn't break the character. It doesn't feel like her just delivering like gags. It still feels like Tatum. And I agree with the stuff about how physical she is and how she fights back, and definitely that's something I like about the film a lot, how tough the females are. And the kill itself, I really like. This is something because we've obviously started doing top 10s. We'll definitely do top 10 kills at some point.
Yes.
But I think this is one of my favourite kills ever. And
agreed.
It's one of those things. There's certain moments and certain scenes you can pick out in this film, and you can just say, like with the kill, I would say, even if I didn't like the film outside of that kill, I would say it's worth it just for that kill, that scene. And it's similar with the opening scene. It's such a great opening scene, I would say. Even if the rest of the film was kind of crap, I would still say you've got to see it for that opening scene. But no, it's a great kill. I love it.
The party, and then Billy turns up, because of course he does, and he and Sydney go off to have a little bit of a talk and kind of reconcile. Now, while that's going on, Gail and Dewey have a whole thing going on where they go to investigate a car that's been missing down the road. Been reported down the road. And so there's this weird juxtaposition of like them finding that while Sydney and Billy are getting it on upstairs. And then we have a great juxtaposition. Again, so many great scenes in this movie. Like, I keep just wanting to say, this is one of my favorite scenes, but we're basically just talking about every single scene in the movie, where we get to one of the most iconic scenes, which is the rules of surviving a horror movie, which, of course, this is so well known for. Now, the teens are watching Halloween, which... fantastic choice, obviously.
Again, it's perfect. Yeah,
it is perfect. And we have Randy stand up and start to discuss the rules of a horror genre and surviving the rules of a horror movie. So you can't drink, you can't have sex, you can't do drugs, and it's just a great juxtaposition, because while that's going on, they kind of are intercutting it with Sydney and Billy getting it on upstairs, kind of juxtaposing, showing that Sydney is breaking the rules. Does that mean she's going to die now? So again, it kind of brings up that whole meta-ness of like, well, the final girl is upstairs breaking the rules, so where is this movie going to go now? So I kind of like that whole kind of meta thing that's going on in that scene.
Because they also do another similar cut like that where I think they've got to the scene in Halloween where Linda like shows her breasts and they're obviously getting excited, wait for the breast shot, and then it cuts to like them having sex upstairs. So that's another little cut, but it's again, I think, a way they subvert the rules in this film, because in a way the rules he sets up in that scene, that they don't all pan out. You know, obviously Sydney has sex and still survives, and you know, many of them are drinking and most of them survive. So it's another clever way of subverting those rules.
Yeah, and then we get the reveal that the car that they've found is Neil Prescott's, Sydney's dad. So again, that kind of leans into the whole, are we gearing up for this to be a reveal that it was Sydney's dad the whole time? And Sydney and Billy finish having sex, and Sydney brings up the whole, who did you call when you were at the police station? Because she's talking about the phone call that she got, and she's like, that would actually be a really clever way for you to throw me off track, was to use your one phone call. And it's like, yeah, this is why this girl is going to survive this movie, because she's smart, she's a thinker. But then Ghostface pops up out of nowhere and like stabs the crap out of Billy. So there goes that red herring. I have to say, the first time I watched this movie, I do remember being really shocked that happened, because I was still at that point, I was convinced.
You were convinced that.
So that was like, Yeah, I was. The first time I ever saw this, that was like, whoa, what just happened? What about you? Yeah. Was that like a shock for you?
I think so. I mean, I think I was in two minds. Obviously, they had set up these other red herrings, so I probably wasn't 100% sold on him being the killer, but I think the movie had probably done a good job of making you think he's the most likely person. And then obviously they throw that spanner in the works. So, yeah, I remember, and we'll get to the twist in a minute. But I remember, when he's like stabbed, it's like, okay, I guess he's not the killer.
It's like, okay, I guess it's proven as in a sense, it's a little bit of an extreme way, but and then of course we get a bit of a chase scene with Sydney showing how awesome she is. She, is trying to get away from Ghostface, and she runs out to the van, and this is where the camera kind of comes. Remember, we said Gail planted the camera at the party, and again, another meta scene that I just absolutely love, where they are watching Randy watch Halloween, and as Randy is watching Halloween, he is screaming at the TV screen, Jamie, turn around, he's behind you. And of course, as that's happening, Ghostface is coming up behind him, and it works as a double meta, because even though the character is Randy, the actor is Jamie Kennedy, so he's kind of almost, saying, Jamie, turn around, to himself. And it's just such a great, setup, such a great meta scene. It's tense, but it's also funny, but it's also like kind of, you're like with Sydney and Kenny, you're like, kid, get out of the house, turn around. Such a great scene.
I think there is something about them watching on the screen, watching him, and in a way we're watching, so it's like a double sort of layer that just actually does make it more tense than it otherwise would be. Because I also like the detail of them being on a time delay, so they should click, oh my god, he's already moved on, so he could be like upon us, sort of thing. And obviously then, not knowing exactly what's happened as well with Randy. So it's all very well done.
And we're all just kind of gearing up, and this is where the movie gets a bit, not chaotic, but you're really starting to wonder what is going on here. Sydney's being chased. All of a sudden, Stu pops out of nowhere. Brandy pops out of nowhere. They're all like yelling at her, like, Sydney, listen to me. And she's like, oh, fuck you both. Like, just screw both of you. And she's just kind of had it. We see poor Dewey come out of the house, and he's been stabbed in the back. And we're all getting really, really chaotic. And it's getting to the point where you're just like, what is happening? And then guess who pops up from upstairs? Good old Billy, who has apparently survived all of his stab wounds and everything, and they let Randy in the house. And then, okay, I know that you've talked about how you don't like Skeet Ulrich, but you got to admit that scene where he turns around and we finally get the reveal that it is him, and he just says that we all go a little mad sometimes line. Like, oh yeah, it's great. That is a great shot. And so we get the reveal that it actually is Billy, and I just think that the way they play with the red herring of, is it Billy, is it not Billy? And it just kind of keeps you on your toes. I actually think it works out to be like a really great reveal, because when you go back and you rewatch the film, you can see the hints, but because there are so many red herrings and because they play with it so much, that when you finally get to that final reveal, I don't know about you, but it was a shock for me, for it to finally absolutely be Billy. It was just like, wow, that was so well done. And then, of course, we have the double twist that it's not just Billy, it's Billy and Stu. And so that's a great payoff. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about that twist and like, how did you like that one when you first watched it?
Yeah, definitely. It was very sort of shocking. And I think for a lot of the film, you might just think, well, if it turned out to be Billy, it might be a bit obvious. But so it sort of works on those both levels. It works as like a nice like turnaround at the end, because like for a few minutes at least you think, okay, he's dead now, so it can't be him. And then obviously they reveal it, and they sort of, I like the touch of him revealing sort of how they did it as well. They used, fake blood, the stuff they used from Carrie, another nice pop culture reference. And so they do actually reveal how they did it, which I liked. These sequels, we all obviously talk about this idea of it being two killers, because that's something which maybe as they go through loses its impact a little bit. But I think certainly in this first film, when they're doing it for the first time, it's a great sort of twist to it. And I think in a way the reveal at the end is what sort of justifies the whole Billy thing and the way he's been acting in the film. And obviously it's when Matthew Lillard really comes into his own and he just goes crazy. And I mean, realistically, I don't think like Ulrich can really out-act him.
Not in this,
out-hamming, let's say.
No.
I mean, there's a moment when he tries, but I think like for overacting and playing that manic sort of character, and it just fits so well in the scene, I think, because you just see these two like egotistical maniacs and just the carnage and just how over the top they are, and just how sick they are, because there's obviously them doing like the fake sort of stabbing to like make it look convincing, and Sydney just looks on. It's like, you fucking nut jobs, basically.
I know.
And I just love like the energy of that last scene and how they just explode, and just stuff like at one point Billy, when Sydney like sort of goes missing and like turns the tables on them, him just ripping up like the couch and the feathers flying. I sort of love that sort of, and again it works perfectly for the subversion where you've got this female character who has been pursued throughout the film and has been like a victim largely, but how she turns the tables and it makes them mad. But it's such an entertaining final scene, and just
it really is. There are some sorry, you go.
Well, just stuff like Stu on the phone when she says, we're gonna, I'm gonna call the police on you. It's like, Mum and Dad is gonna be so mad.
And Matthew Lillard sells it so well. Like in the hands of a different actor, it could be very cheesy, but he's so good.
It's sort of interesting as well how I certainly think this. You probably will. It makes sense then. Actually, Billy is sort of the ringleader. It feels
definitely
like this was his idea, and you can almost read it as he sort of. Because I don't think it's ever confirmed how long he'd been dating Sydney, but it's
2
almost...
years. They say it at the beginning, 2 years.
Oh, 2 years, because I wasn't sure if it was something where he probably pursued the relationship for that sole reason.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, possibly. It would sort of make sense, but...
Yeah.
Yeah, it actually does make sense that, okay, Billy's actually the ringleader, and that's quite a nice twist, because you wouldn't necessarily have seen that coming from that character. Whereas, Stu early in the film, he's a bit of a sicko anyway with some of the comments he's making. So if it was revealed that he was like the mastermind, you may not have been that shocked. So it's actually quite a nice subversion, I think, with that as well.
I think Stu's too chaotic. Like, I think he's too chaotic for you to like fully believe that he could. Like, I've been watching this YouTuber who has been doing analysis of. He does analysis of Scream scenes, and he tries to figure out who is who in which scene, and he points out that it's almost definitely always Billy on the phone, because Stu is not together enough to kind of make the phone calls. Like, you can't imagine Stu actually doing. I've actually heard people, though, a lot of people have said that Stu they find him to be the scariest Ghostface because he's so crazy, and I actually kind of get that, Billy has a motivation, like they try to say, oh, there's no motivation, but then Billy reveals that Sydney's mother was sleeping with Billy's father, and that's why his parents got divorced. But Stu really doesn't have a motivation. He just seems to be along for the ride, and he's just kind of insane, and it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and that's quite good as well, because it represents the two different sides of this. It represents, the more wacky out there sort of film nerd who has just let his imagination sort of go crazy and has led to this. And like you said, he's along for the ride. And then the more clinical, cold, sort of calculated, and obviously different motivations as well. And there is a shot, actually, I'm not too sure, but it's actually, I did wonder in the scene whether, like, Stu, his character, knew all along that was the motivation, because there's just a shot where he looks quite surprised when Billy reveals it. So
I don't think he knew. Because when Billy's all like, your slut mum was banging my dad, there's a shot of Stu and he's like, and so you think, oh crap, he actually didn't know. But now that we've obviously talked about, I do want to mention one bit from Matthew Lillard that I love. So it's along the lines of my parents are going to be so mad. But there's an improvised bit where Billy grabs the phone from him and then he throws it at him and he's like, oh, you hit me with the phone, you dick. That was actually just like Skeet Ulrich accidentally pegged the phone at Matthew Lillard. And that was just Matthew Lillard just going along with it. But once you know that it's Billy and Stu, so many of the scenes that lead up to it just take on so much more significance. Like we were talking about, the video store scene with Randy is so much more sinister now that you know. Even the scene where they're talking about the kills the next day at school, Stu and Sydney's like, how do you gut someone? And Stu's like, well, you take a knife and then you slit it from, and Billy's like, hey, it's called tact, you fuckbag. And you think that it's just Billy being protective of Sydney, but in retrospect, it's Billy going, dude.
You could read it as, this is too far.
Down.
You don't want to give her a clue.
You don't want to give it away. Yeah. And there's also a very small scene when Billy turns up at the party. He turns up in the front door and he gives a slight look to Stu as if to say, I did it, Tatum's dead. And again, it's one of those kind of blink and you'll miss it kind of moments that you do.
Picked up on that.
Yeah, just next time you do a rewatch, when he comes to the door, he just gives a very quick look and like a little nod. And it's I also want to talk about, I've talked about how well planned this film was. Wes Craven, and again, on rewatch, keep an eye out for this, but Wes Craven actually instructed Matthew Lillard and Skeet Ulrich and their stunt doubles to hold their knives differently. So you can actually always tell when it's Billy and when it's Stu. So if you watch closely, Billy always holds the knife in one hand. He'll always hold it in one hand, and he also chokes his victims. He chokes Sydney and he chokes Casey, whereas Stu holds his knife like this. He holds it up above his head. And again, just watch when you're rewatching the film, keep an eye out, because they were actually instructed to do that so that when you go back and rewatch the film, you can very clearly see who killed whom. And it's actually really interesting. And I just love, because unfortunately the later films, because they suffered so much from rewrites, like on the set, they don't have that same kind of careful planning that this one did. And so a lot of, like, when you rewatch the scenes and you know, like, to look out for these little mannerisms, it's actually really cool, and it all just kind of comes together really well. There's a YouTube video that I'll recommend. Guys, if you go and follow someone called Zach Cherry, he does Scream. He has a whole breakdown of how Billy and Stu pulled off the opening scene with Casey, and it's brilliant. He manages to break down exactly where each of them are at every point in time. And when you watch that and then you rewatch the first scene, it's just amazing how much planning and detail went into that scene, because it works out perfectly. And it actually works out in such a way that it is completely believable how they managed to pull off those first two murders. And it's just really, really great. So just everything about that final reveal and the way it plays out, for me, was just fantastic.
May argue then overall, like, the reveal, I don't know, then it's not that interesting just because it just turns out to be Billy all along. But I like the way it works. I like, you know, the fact you can go back over the film and pick out these things. And, you know, obviously his motivation and stuff, I think, obviously works. And it's certainly, when I watched it for the first time, I definitely had those, like, gotcha moments where I was like, oh my god, what's going on? And
yeah,
I think they obviously do a good job, I think, of just bookending the film with these two really dramatic, engrossing scenes. And I think the fact that I love the party scene actually goes on for so long, because it's probably at least 20 minutes long overall. I mean, maybe a bit longer,
possibly more. Yeah,
because actually, yeah, it's not that far into the film when they cut to the party, so I think it does go on for a fair bit. And I sort of like that as well, the fact that it does slowly build like that, and we almost get this crazy sort of climax of these two maniacs just going nuts. And yeah, it's very enjoyable. And Gail, the fact that she does end up being quite heroic in the end, actually, it's good in that sense. So
yes, Gail is awesome. Sydney's awesome. I love when Sydney puts on the Ghostface costume and turns it around on the guys and, like, makes the phone call and is all like, you know, guess which movie this is? This is, guess who just, you know, called the police on your sorry motherfucking asses. And then, of course, she takes on both Billy and Stu. Her fight with Stu is just epic, and, you know, dropping a TV on his head. I think that's a pretty way for Stu to go. You know, the horror lover.
I always had a thing for you, Sid, and then she's like, in your dreams. And I think that could be a smart callback to Nightmare 3, because of course there's a famous TV on her head scene in that. And again, you've got the Craven link, so you could almost read that as like a callback to that. But
absolutely,
even if it's not, it's really cool.
It's really cool. And of course, one of my favorite bits is after they've taken down Billy, and she and Randy and Gail are standing over, and Randy's like, hold on, this is the moment in the film where the killer comes back for one last scare. And then Billy starts to get up, and Sydney just point blank shoots him in the head and is just like, not in my movie. And I love that. And then I just want to talk briefly about, again, how awesome Gale Weathers is, because the movie ends with Gale Weathers, who has literally just been through, like, attempted murder and has almost died and has watched everyone die around her, getting on camera and being all like, here's what happened, folks.
Yeah.
I'm like, the woman is, I mean, for everything bad you can say about her, she's got spunk, man. I mean, look at her. 2 hours after she was almost gutted, she's like, all right, let's go. Let's get this show on the road. And just a really strong ending to that, like, just such a great movie. And just such a great end scene.
Nice way, to end the film. Yeah, definitely. And I think something to say about this movie, because I probably mentioned it a bit before, but it's one of those things, even if you can pick holes in it, and you possibly can. I think if you look hard enough with anything, you can. I think what's good about this review is like there's so many things you've mentioned that I didn't even think, and I didn't know because of obviously you know a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. So it actually makes me respect the movie and Wes Craven, and even more now because a lot of the tidbits you mentioned I didn't even know. So that just goes to a whole new level of like details. But I think it's one of those movies where it is a favorite of mine and it has held up over the years. And I think one of the reasons is because consistently throughout the film it is so entertaining. That there's very rarely like a weaker scene, and it's just I think there's something to be said for a good fun movie like this where it is consistently entertaining throughout the film, even if you want to pick little holes in the film. And I think sometimes it's a taste thing. Obviously, there are people who, if they were not quite this generation, they maybe a bit younger than we are, they might look back and say, "Well, is Scream really that good?" And there's some people,
yes, it is.
Well, I'm going to say yes, it is as well. But it's one of those things where the 90s look to some people might be a bit dated now and just stuff like that. But no, I think I would still challenge those people and say, well, look how entertaining it is. Look how consistently seen how much fun it is and how good the characters are. And I think you make a good point about how well paced and how well thought out the whodunit is, because that's probably something that does get overlooked, because obviously a lot of the standout things for people are like the dialogue and the jokes and stuff. So and as a horror movie, it's worth saying it does hold up pretty well as well, because it is one where they get a good balance where obviously it stands out and is iconic because of the satire, but it does work as a horror movie as well. So that's something I like about it. I think the opening scene is really scary, and obviously there's quite a fun kill scene with the Fonz in the middle, and then obviously there's some good horror at the end as well, and obviously Tatum's death as well. So there's definitely it gets the right balance for me of like the horror but the satire. Give it the perfect 10, but I am going to go very high, and some of this might be on nostalgia, but I think even talking to you, I think maybe just because of some of the little tidbits, I think that maybe elevates it a bit as well. But I'll give it a 9. I think it's very strong. I think it's pretty much a perfect movie overall. Maybe the Billy stuff drags it down the most for me if I do have that nitpick, but because I think even accepting the ending and how that stuff makes sense, it still doesn't change the fact that he's sort of a charisma-free zone throughout the movie. But, really strong though. So it's obviously not bad enough to like really take away from my enjoyment. So 9 out of 10.
Very nice. I love this film. Everything about this film is just so good. Like you said, the horror elements are really good. It is genuinely scary. Not anymore for me because I've seen it so many times. But the first time I watched it, this film is effective. The opening scene alone is so intense. I love the thought and the care and the planning that went into this film, obviously because they knew who the killers were going to be eventually. So like I said, there was lots of thought going into the mannerisms and the tics. I think the red herrings work really well. I love the back and forth with Billy. Did he do it? No, he didn't do it. Maybe he did it. Oh no, he's dead. Oh no, he's alive. Like, I think they did that really well to kind of keep you on your toes so that when they finally do reveal that it's him, it's like, it does feel like a surprise. Stu obviously being a reveal as well. Fantastic. Great characterization. Sydney Prescott is a great final girl. Gail Weathers, Dewey, Tatum, all of these characters are so rich and so well done. The dialogue's fantastic, which is something that horror films do suffer from a bit. We've obviously talked about this recently with the Halloween films. Dialogue is not always on point, but it is with this one. And you mentioned earlier that the film is paced really well. And I wanted to say yes because I always forget that this film is actually 2 hours long. Because every time I watch it, I swear it only feels like an hour and a half because it just goes, it's just so packed. Like the action moves along so well, everything moves along so organically that for me, I always forget that it is actually 2 hours. I always think that it's only an hour and a half. So I actually have no complaints about this film. So I would actually give it 10 out of 10 because I think it's just that good. There's nothing in this film that brings it down for me. I think that the kills are fantastic. I think the characterization is fantastic. The direction is great. The script is great. Like I said, it's not only my favorite horror movie, it is one of my favorite films of all time. Like it's in my top 10 favorite films because it's just that good. And I rewatch it so often. It has such a high rewatchability. Like it's just, you can always just kind of put it on and just enjoy it no matter how many times you've seen it. As like I said when we were talking about doing this review, I could do a review for this movie in my sleep because I just watch it that often. So for me, it's a 10 out of 10. As we go through the rest of the franchise, we'll see the ups and downs, but this first movie for me is brilliant and is perfect, and everyone should just go and watch it. If you haven't seen Scream, go and watch it now. It's fantastic.
I think there was never going to be any doubt with this one that we were both going to be high on it. Whereas it will be interesting to see how the sequels hold up. There will be some ups and downs, but that's our review. You've got a really meaty review. This is
we got into it.
Easily our longest review to date, so I think you guys are definitely getting a Halloween treat. I can tell you that. So thanks for listening, guys. Hope you enjoyed the review. I hope you like Scream. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, what you thought of it. Also, I guess if you did see it at the time, then maybe some stories would be cool. Just what was your experience of it and memories of seeing it at the time, because it definitely does feel like a time capsule where you sort of maybe get more appreciation out of it if you were there, or if you at least have memories of seeing it at a young age. So those comments, those stories would be cool. Let us know your thoughts anyway. And obviously we'll be back very soon with Scream 2. We're going to work our way up to the new film coming out in January. Share us out on social media, like and subscribe.
Also, guys, if you're watching this on Halloween, head over to my channel where you will be able to see the ranking of our Halloween films, because that will be out as well. We've obviously recently gone through the entire franchise, and there is now a ranking video on my channel where we go from our least favorites to our favorites. So if you're in a Halloween mood and you want some more content from us, head on over to Rachel McDonald. You'll find our rankings there.
And you really should give Rachel shit for trying to defend Halloween Kills, because that's utterly ridiculous. In the past week, she's actually bumped her score up, which is just ridiculous. I mean, she was already being too generous on it, but to defend that monstrosity.
To be honest, guys, once you see my rankings, there's probably more shit that you can give me as well. So definitely head on over and tell us what you think.
I think there will be some diversity with our rankings on that, but it should be a good video. So check that out, guys. Thanks for listening, and happy Halloween. See you soon.
Happy Halloween.
Bye.